Good evening, everyone. And for those of you in the Philippines and in Asia, magandang umaga. Salamat sa pagdalo. I have the honor of introducing our speaker today. He's going to be talking about a very important but also very controversial topic, the Plaza Miranda bombing. He's no stranger, of course, to Berkeley. He's no stranger to our Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Joseph Scalice is a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Humanities at NTU, Nanyang Technological University, and he's the author of a forthcoming book, The Drama of Dictatorship, Martial Law, and the Communist Parties of the Philippines. That's in the plural, of course. He received his PhD from Cal at our department, the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies in 2018. And if I'm not mistaken, is this your first time back here at Cal since you finished, Joseph?
It is, Leloy. It's good to be back.
Okay,
last I was here, I was a lowly lecturer.
Okay, little lecture. You were never lowly, good sir. All right. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Joseph. Welcome back to Cal.
Thank you, Leloy. Thank you for that introduction. It is good to be back. And I am excited about today's topic and the discussion. Claudio mentioned, as Leloy mentioned, I will be speaking on the topic of the Plaza Miranda bombing, one of the most controversial topics in Philippine history. I'm going to take a moment here to open my presentation. Here we are. I've entitled my talk, 3 Grenades in August. 50 years since the bombing of Plaza Miranda in the Philippines. I should say from the outset that thankfully, only 2 of those grenades exploded, but there were in fact, on August 21, 1971, 3 grenades thrown onto the stage of the Liberal Party rally in Plaza Miranda in Metro Manila in the Philippines. The event marked a turning point, I would argue, in Philippine democracy and in the political history of the country. The talk that I'm going to be giving today, while it will deal with the forensic details of the bombing itself, this is sort of an inescapable question, this will not be my central focus. I have written extensively on the events from 1969 to 1972, from the election of November 1969 to the 1972 declaration of martial law by Ferdinand Marcos that put an end to post-war democracy in the country. My forthcoming book with the University of Wisconsin Press, which is expected to be out in early 2022, entitled The Drama of Dictatorship, Martial Law, and the Communist Parties of the Philippines, includes a chapter that examines in really unprecedented levels of detail the events around the bombing of Plaza Miranda, the evidence and the outcome. The majority of the evidence that I will be presenting today is also available in my doctoral dissertation, which I entitled Crisis of Revolutionary Leadership. It is available for download from the UC Berkeley website. If you want to check any of my sources, you're welcome to go there to look at the footnotes. I will be leaving out many of them for the purposes of a more fluid talk. My interest in this talk, above all, is to present the historical context and significance of the bombing. 9 people were killed and scores wounded. The numbers vary, 60, 70, 80, depending upon the account that you're looking at, were wounded. And the wounds included paralysis, deafness, blindness, etc., as a result of the bombing of August 21, 1971. Plaza Miranda needs to be introduced before anything else. It was the center of public life from 1946 to 1972. Metro Manila was the center of political life for the archipelago, and Plaza Miranda was the center of political life for Manila. Political rallies, particularly the most important ones, were staged here. While the president might deliver addresses in Luneta Plaza, issues of controversy, issues of significance, the debates of the day were all staged in Plaza Miranda, at the center of what was the working class area of Quiapo, Manila, adjacent to the Quiapo Church of the Black Nazarene. It was a public space, and traditional politicians and radicals staging demonstrations gathered in Plaza Miranda regularly to address crowds of 10, 20, as many as 70,000. It was symbolic in some ways of the character of post-war democracy. I do not want to in any way idealize this period. It was marked by dynastic politics, oligarchic rule, and shifting alliances between rival sections of the ruling elite around the regularity of elections. Every 2 years, every 4 years, like the turning of the tide, the shifting alliances of the ruling elite washed over the country. They could be termed the ins and the outs. Those who were in power now could be expected in 4 years' time to be out. Those who were out could be expected in 4 years to be in. Nonetheless, while I do not idealize this period of Philippine democracy, there was something special about it, especially considering what Philippine democracy has, I would argue, become. To be frank, what democracy in much of the world has become. The debates that were conducted in Plaza Miranda, even by traditional politicians, had far more substance than most political speeches do today. There were actual ideas and coherent arguments that were being presented in Plaza Miranda. It was not simply a question of standing on stage and dancing budots or something like that, as politicians are wont to do in the Philippines today. There was an idea that you had to make a coherent appeal. That world of political debate, of democracy, of an appeal to the electorate, that world died on August 21, 1971. The Liberal Party was the opposition party of the time, the ruling class opposition party to Ferdinand Marcos. And this was the announcement of their electoral slate. It was called a meeting de avance. It was a standard part of political life. They stood on stage, they proclaimed the electoral slate for the midterm election, the senatorial candidates, when 3 grenades at about 9:10 p.m. were thrown on stage, wounding all of the candidates on stage, 2 of them severely, Jovito Salonga and Sergio Osmeña, who were hospitalized in critical condition. Salonga suffered blindness in an eye. Osmeña had shrapnel to the spine. Other candidates were in wheelchairs. The real damage, however, was to the audience. They were the ones that were dead. A photographer for the Manila Times, a 5-year-old cigarette vendor, a father falling over the bodies of his children. It was an event of tremendous trauma. The analogy is somewhat fraught, but if one is forced to come up with an analogy, the bombing of the Liberal Party rally in Plaza Miranda on August 21 is effectively the correlate to the assassination of JFK. They are not the same event, certainly not in their world significance. But my point is, this event shocked the nation in a way that no other event had. It was an end of innocence. It was the end of post-war democracy. And with the 1971 election, there would not be another freely held election in the country for more than a decade and a half. Who was responsible for the Plaza Miranda bombing? The leading suspects in popular conception bandied about were either Ferdinand Marcos, who bombed his rivals so that he would have a pretext for imposing martial law. This was a very credible conception. I will go into why in a bit. Or, as Marcos charged, It was carried out by Senator Aquino of the Liberal Party, who, as I will lay out, was absent during the bombing for suspicious reasons, or suspect reasons, in cahoots with the Communist Party, who was opposed to Marcos at the time. These were the two leading suspects bandied about in the press. In the wake of the initial investigation, however, and this is often forgotten, the accused by January 1972 were neither Marcos nor Aquino nor the Communist Party. It was former Mayor Antonio Villegas, formerly of the Liberal Party, who, through his loyal sidekick, Lieutenant Colonel Alfredo Lim, who had a long career in Philippine politics afterwards, ordered two hitmen, Maximiano Magat and Benigno Urquico, whom he had released from prison, to carry out the bombing. The story went that because the Liberal Party, for complex reasons that I can't go into, decided not to nominate Villegas despite his extraordinary popularity, and nominated Ramon Bagatsing instead as candidate for mayor, Villegas, in an act of reprisal, had ordered the grenades thrown on stage. This was, in fact, the official narrative, never established, but this was the official narrative through the period of the imposition of martial law in 1972, which effectively buried the Plaza Miranda bombing. The issue did not resurface until after martial law. A point needs to be absolutely clear at the outset. Martial law was an utterly brutal regime. Between September 1972 and February 1977, a total of 70,000 people were arrested for political reasons by the martial law regime. A critical point should be made. The great mass of those arrested, 70,000 people, were neither traditional politicians, trapos as we refer to them in the Philippines, nor members of the Communist Party of the Philippines, the CPP. They were workers, peasants, and students, and they bore the brunt of state repression throughout the martial law period. These were the stakes. The Plaza Miranda bombing was a critical pretext or justification for martial law by Ferdinand Marcos. And martial law was, in its essence, not about Marcos's theft and corruption, not about prolonging Marcos's term in office. Martial law, at its most fundamental, was about the suppression of the population, of workers, peasants, and students, of suppressing a massive social unrest that had emerged leading up to its imposition. I'm going to structure my presentation today in the following way. The first point, why I've written the Drama of Dictatorship, as I've already outlined, this is where you can look for my citations, both my dissertation and my forthcoming book. I put that there because I want to remind you I will not be able to deal with all of the details here. I'm going to go into the question of sources and evidence first. This is a convoluted procedure. I'm not going to start with the bombing. I'm going to start with the emergence of a narrative that accuses the Communist Party of the Philippines of having carried out that bombing. What were the sources and evidence for this new claim? When did it emerge? And thus our story will begin not in the 1960s, but in the 1980s. Having established the evidence, we will then go back to the historical and social context of the 1960s and the 1970s. We'll then look at the event itself and its outcome. I want to show you two videos that will establish what we're dealing with here. I argue that the CPP is engaged in a series, the Communist Party of the Philippines has engaged in a series of political lies and reversals over the course of its history. And I further argue that the overwhelming weight of historical evidence that is now available strongly demonstrates that the Communist Party of the Philippines was responsible for the 1971 bombing of Plaza Miranda. So I want to first lay out the point. The party and its head, Joma Sison, regularly reverse themselves and lie. I'm going to be opening a video here. I'm going to be showing two. The first video pertains to support for Duterte.
what Sison is engaged in is what is known politically as a big lie.
The Trotskyites are grossly lying when they claim that the CPP supported the presidential candidacy of Duterte.
Well, I would like to thank President Duterte. I'm very proud of him. I was once his teacher, and
What
in
subject,
political
sir?
thought. He was once my student at the Lyceum of the Philippines, and I share in the joy of this success. And I wish him to succeed in his mission as president.
Before, during, and after the 2016 presidential elections, nobody in his right mind believed Duterte when he said that he was left and socialist.
He promises to be the first left president of the Philippines, and he will keep his socialist orientation. That's fine. So I would be satisfied if he would remain patriotic and progressive, and of course he can do the best possible that he can do for the benefit of our people.
This isn't a slight falsehood that he hopes he can get away with. He is attempting to bludgeon the population into the belief that what they themselves witnessed never in fact occurred.
So that video came out of a lecture that I delivered last year regarding the support of the Communist Party for the candidacy of Duterte, which Sison denied, and which this video, among other things, documents that they in fact did. Now, I think one of the reasons for a great deal of growth in the common conception that the CPP may have been responsible for the Plaza Miranda bombing has less to do with the weight of evidence that's been produced, which isn't widely known, and more to do with the growing realization that the party cries wolf, and Sison in particular, routinely being exposed for reversing itself and lying. Now, when Sison and company are in reference to the Trotskyite or Trotskyites, they are almost certainly in reference to me. And in response to this lecture, the CPP published multiple statements attacking me and claiming that I was spewing the filth of the CIA and the military, etc. But they made this point. The Trotskyite, that's me, presents as evidence the party's view that repression breeds resistance. He insists that the criminal motive of the CPP behind the Plaza Miranda bombing was to provoke fascist suppression, as this will push people to support the armed revolution. Scalice distorts and denigrates the CPP's historical materialist view that fascist suppression engenders revolutionary resistance as what he sees as motive for carrying out terrorist crimes such as the Plaza Miranda bombing. Scalice makes it appear that the CPP subscribes to a fatalist view that state repression will spontaneously push people to take up arms. And I don't make this appear. This is the line of the party. The party, and Joma Sison in particular, have routinely, over the course of decades, claimed that fascism, fascist dictatorship, and martial law are good for revolution. Let me make this point with another video, my second and last video. This video was recorded only a couple days ago, a talk that Sison gave online.
Duterte is now old. He is sick physically and mentally. He has bankrupted the economy and his own government because of corruption and military overspending, and he has little allowance for borrowing from the crisis-stricken world capitalist system. Best thing that can happen for the benefit of the Philippine Revolution is for him to impose a fascist dictatorship on the people. He will be finished in 1 or 2 years after that. Even right now, he's the best recruiter of the CPP and NPA because of his traitorous, tyrannical, genocidal, corrupt, and mendacious character.
Again, that was February 28th. That was this week. Sison declared the best thing that can happen for the revolution is for Duterte to impose fascist dictatorship on the people. Let that sink in. This is the political line of the party. The best thing for the revolution is the imposition of fascist dictatorship on the people. I will come back to this point at my conclusion, but if you're interested in defending democracy, you should be alert to someone whose political line is a welcoming of, quote, fascist dictatorship. In what context did the allegation that the CPP had carried out the Plaza Miranda bombing emerge? Rumors had been circulating in the CPP since 1974 that the party had, in fact, carried out the bombing. So much so that Rodolfo Salas, who became head of the party when Sison was captured in the late 1970s, conducted what he termed a discreet investigation, but said that he could not find conclusive evidence that the party had in fact carried out the bombing. The reason he couldn't find conclusive evidence, I would argue, is that those who had carried out the bombing were dead and those who were aware of it were in prison. In 1984, someone who was aware that there had been a member of the party who claimed to have carried out the bombing approached Salonga, one of the victims of the bombing, and informed him that the party had been responsible for it. In 1986, Victor Corpus, who had been a leader of the NPA and of the party since his defection from the military in 1970, came forward with a letter that he wrote to famed Philippine journalist Jose Pete Lacaba. And in his letter, Dear Pete, he said that the party was responsible for the Plaza Miranda bombing and that he had been present during Sison's planning of it. This was a member of the Central Committee accusing the party of the bombing. That letter, while it was made public, made very little splash. At the time, Defense Minister Enrile was engaged in a coup plot against Aquino. It was speculated that perhaps the letter was part of the coup plot against Aquino because her husband, Ninoy Aquino, now dead, was in fact possibly implicated in the bombing. And second, it was presumed that it may have been part of a publicity campaign for Pete Lacaba's upcoming movie for which he was a scriptwriter. The charges went nowhere. The charges exploded with a vengeance across Philippine society in August 1989. Now, the context in which this emerged was the crisis of the Aquino administration, which was straining to hold itself together after coup attempt after coup attempt after coup attempt being staged by the leaders of the military that she had attempted to incorporate into her administration in the wake of the overthrow of Ferdinand Marcos. But it was not simply the crisis of the Aquino administration. It was the crisis of the CPP and of world Stalinism. In the face of globalization, the Stalinist bureaucracy in the Soviet Union liquidated itself, unable to maintain its nationalist economic position. And in China, the Communist Party was well along the path of capitalist restoration. The CPP, looking for international allies, was utterly isolated. The task of finding international allies and funders for the CPP fell to Joma Sison, who, having been released from prison, you can see him here making the Laban sign in support of Corazon Aquino in 1986, departed the country in September to look for international allies. Over the course of 1986, he attempted to establish friendly ties with the Aquino administration. A peak of this may have been on May Day, 1986, when he stood on stage at Luneta alongside Cory Aquino, standing to her left. To her right was Defense Minister or the head of the military, Fidel Ramos. And this was a May Day rally of workers. The band played the Internationale, Bangon sa pagkakabusabos, and they raised the hammer and sickle flag. This is from Sison's own account. They were promoting the claim that Aquino could be a revolutionary government. The military attempts, however, the coup attempts, shifted Aquino's administration drastically to the right. She turned on the Communist Party. Their troops under the command of Alfredo Lim, someone we've already encountered, opened fire on demonstrating peasants in January 1987, and relations between the CPP and Aquino soured. Sison, now overseas, sought international allies. In his book, The Philippine Revolution, The Leader's View, which was never published in the Philippines, he proclaimed Gorbachev to be a revolutionary figure. He hailed Gorbachev and claimed that the party's criticisms of the Soviet Union had been based on inadequate evidence. He was looking to find relations with the Soviet Union. Obviously, that did not work out. And within 3 years, he denounced his rivals in the CPP as, quote, Gorbachevites. The strained relations with Aquino, however, left Sison in exile, and he took up exile in the Netherlands, where he is to this day. It is in this context, then, that in August 1989, a coherent set of revelations surrounding the Plaza Miranda bombing first exploded across public consciousness. A reporter by the name of Gregg Jones, who was a journalist for the Washington Post, had conducted a series of 100 interviews with rank and file members of the NPA, with leaders of the CPP, both in the Philippines and in exile. Gregg Jones interviewed Joma Sison and was welcomed by Sison. But when he published his book, Red Revolution, he included the chapter Ghosts of Plaza Miranda, in which, citing ranking members of the party, former members of the Central Committee, who were, in his account, anonymous in keeping with standard journalistic procedure, but were listed as, for example, a founding member of the Central Committee, thus narrowing it down to 12 possible candidates. He detailed how the party had, in fact, been responsible for the Plaza Miranda bombing. These first became something that people were aware of in the Philippines, not with the publication of his book, but with publication of material drawn from the book prior to its publication by Amando Doronila on the front page of the Manila Chronicle from August 3 to 6, 1989. Some points should be made about the book Red Revolution. 10 pages of the book are dedicated to the Plaza Miranda bombing out of 400. The Plaza Miranda bombing is not the focus of this book. And in fact, it's not really even tied into the larger narrative of the book. The narrative of the book is about the growth of the NPA. And one is compelled to say that Jones's account is sympathetic. He declared, I am personally opposed to violence, but having witnessed the difficult trials and suffering of the Filipino peasants, workers, and urban poor, I cannot have judgment on those who decide to take up arms against a system that has ignored their needs. And then regarding the Plaza Miranda bombing account itself, he said, though each source offered some new piece to the Plaza Miranda puzzle, all agreed on one point. Sison conceived of the plan in an effort to provoke a harsh crackdown by Marcos that would drive more Filipinos into the revolutionary movement. That was the conception. It would provoke repression, which would create a revolutionary movement. The second point was that it would also consolidate the alliance with the opposition, as Marcos's crackdown would consolidate ties between the CPP and their Liberal Party allies. Who was Gregg Jones? This becomes a critical question. He was an award-winning journalist. A series of articles that he wrote in 1982 exposing the inhuman conditions in private homes for the mentally ill was quite noteworthy. This is not the sort of material covered by someone who is a CIA agent. This was the response of Joma Sison. Gregg Jones is a paid agent of the CIA. The book is a publication of the CIA. It is an anti-communist book. The book does not offer a single shred of evidence, an outrageous claim. The use of anonymous sources, for example, founding member of the Central Committee, was termed by Sison a foul trick, which anyone familiar with the way journalists proceed regarding sources for sensitive material knows that this is standard. This line is still the line of Sison and of the CPP. Gregg Jones' Red Revolution was published by the CIA. Jones was a CIA agent. Jones was responded in the press at the time. He was in Mexico at this point. He has a new journalistic assignment for the Washington Post. He points out, or I should note, it's in the intro to his book, that his travel arrangements and interviews in Netherlands were arranged by Luis Halandoni, a leading member of the Communist Party and close confidant of Joma Sison. This is why Joma Sison was interviewed by Gregg Jones. Gregg Jones' access to the members of the CPP was facilitated by the party precisely because he was regarded as a reputable journalist. He was introduced to the National Democratic Movement into the party first by Dean Armando Malay, beloved figure of UP, and his wife Paula Malay. The credentials of the Malays in national democracy are unquestioned even by Sison. And they were the ones who introduced Jones to the mass movement. And at the time, Paula Malay told the press that the allegations that Jones was with the CIA were, quote, unfair. Jones responded, Sison took the opportunity to launch entirely unfounded, libelous attacks on my book and my integrity. At stake here is much more than the credibility of a book or its author. Sison knows who most of my top-level sources are. He knows their credibility. He knows his allegations are shameless falsehoods. Unable to find fault with the Plaza Miranda revelations on factual grounds, he resorts to reverse Red Scare tactics. He attempts to depict me as a sinister psywar agent, a term that he regularly used against Jones, with a political axe to grind. Apparently, Sison hopes to draw attention away from the revelations that some members of the left and revolutionary movement feel he should answer for. For the record, my established credentials and reputation for fairness as a journalist were cited by CPP leaders as reasons for giving me access that enabled me to write this book from inside the Philippine Revolution. And he termed Sison's attacks and slanders against him the most upsetting experience of my personal and professional life. I sympathized. Never have I had my integrity and credibility so maliciously or falsely called into question. I will not be intimidated into silence. The book stands on the strength of its research and documentation, and nothing Sison says can change this fact. Now, this is 1989. What has been the career of Jones since then? I don't know all of the details, but he published a book in 2012 on the Philippine-American War, in which he wrote extensively on how the American campaign of what he termed torture and war crimes profoundly altered the political candidacy of Theodore Roosevelt. That was the center of his book. Again, this is not the perspective of the CIA. I should point out that the dismissal of accusations as a CIA agent in psywar is a standard trope of Sison. He did it recently against me. Here's a really ugly image he circulated of me and Leon Trotsky as rats. Sison termed me a pathologically rabid anti-communist and a CIA psywar agent posing as an academic Trotskyite, a paid agent of the CIA, and stated that all Berkeley knows that I'm a paid agent of the CIA. The faculty of the UC Berkeley Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies published a generous open letter defending me, which I found quite moving. Here they said, Sison claimed all Berkeley knew that the CIA funded Scalice's research. We at Berkeley know nothing of the sort. We reject these malicious, reckless, and unfounded allegations. We stand with Joseph Scalice. You can see the entire letter, which was published online. My point here is that this is Sison's standard defense against any allegation. Either you're with the CPP or you're an agent of the CIA and a psywar agent. And he feels the need to adduce no evidence to substantiate these claims. It was in this manner that he dismissed Gregg Jones' book. And as a scholar, I will say that those of us who research the Philippine Communist Party are deeply indebted to the work of Gregg Jones and rely on his account. I don't agree with all of Jones's political conclusions, etc., and I've revised many of his findings. But this was a groundbreaking work, and it certainly was not the product of CIA machinations. Now, two of the sources that were cited by Gregg Jones are particularly problematic: Victor Corpus and Ruben Guevara. They were highly placed members of the Central Committee, but they both had a sordid political trajectory. Victor Corpus had been a member of the Philippine Military Academy. He there encountered Joma Sison in 1966 when Sison delivered an address to the officer corps of the Philippine Military Academy, encouraging them to take up the perspective of national democracy. Corpus was inspired by this and eventually came into the orbit of the KM and the SDK, two youth organizations tied to the Communist Party of the Philippines. He married into these organizations, and when he became an instructor at the Philippine Military Academy, he scrapped the syllabus and taught a class on how to carry out a coup d'etat. This is in 1970. As we will see, in December 1970, Victor Corpus staged a raid on the PMA armory and joined the NPA. He became immediately a leader of the CPP and a member of its Central Committee. And he claims that in February, March 1971, he was present for discussions with Second Sison where they hammered out the plans for the bombing of Plaza Miranda. The second particularly suspect figure is Ruben Guevara. Guevara was a founding member of the CPP. He came out of their union work at US Tobacco. Guevara is I find him a despicable figure. He was a hitman for the party. He rose to prominence because he was responsible for carrying out executions, even of members of the party. We know that he was responsible for executing people that the party claimed to be agents, shooting them in the head. I document this in my doctoral dissertation. Both Victor Corpus and Ruben Guevara in the 1980s integrated themselves into the military apparatus, rising to prominence and securing promotions. Ruben Guevara became military intelligence. These are thus highly suspect figures, but they were in fact privy to discussions around the bombing would have taken place. They were in the correct political circles. The fact that they pursued a particularly rotten political trajectory does not alter the fact that they may have been sources of information, nor were they the only sources of Gregg Jones' account. I go detailed through every piece of evidence presented, including new pieces of evidence in my doctoral dissertation and in my forthcoming book. Allow me to summarize the evidence that emerged in the 1980s and has since accumulated since then. 4 former members of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Philippines accused Sison of plotting the bombing. Danny Cordero, we know, and I'm going to go through this in a bit more detail in a bit, claimed that he himself, on orders from Sison, threw a grenade on stage. And when he made this claim, he was executed by the CPP, an execution overseen by Ruben Guevara. Multiple members of the CPP delegation to China now claim that they were told in advance that the bombing would take place. What is more, in July 1971 through August 1971, leading couples in the party all departed the country for China just weeks prior to the bombing, taking Sison's own children with them. As a result of the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus that followed the bombing, there was a crackdown. But leading members of the party who departed as couples, which is odd. It seems like they were prepared to stay away for quite some time and took Sison's children with them, were absent. And finally, as I will establish in my account, the party fundamentally reoriented its political activity 5 days before the bombing in a way that corresponded to their intentions after the bombing, almost as if they knew what was about to take place. Now, why is this? What was the perspective of the Communist Party of the Philippines? I can only go over this very briefly now because I am pressed to cover many of the political developments that occurred in 1971, and because I've delivered an extensive lecture on this topic earlier last year, which is available on YouTube. I would encourage you to watch it. I entitled it First as Tragedy, Second as Farce. The Stalinist Communist Party of the Philippines was not fighting for a communist revolution in the Philippines. They were not fighting for socialism. They were explicitly fighting for what they called national democracy, the first stage of what they called a two-stage revolution. This was in service to the bureaucratic interests of the Stalinist bureaucrats in Moscow and Beijing, who were fighting not for world socialist revolution, but for the nationalist perspective of socialism in one country. Because, and this is the critical point, because the party said that it was fighting a national democratic revolution, land reform, etc., not socialism, they would form a bloc of 4 classes and an alliance, not just of workers and peasants, but of the petty bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie, whom you see here as the Pambansang Burguesia, an alliance with the national bourgeoisie. This is the justification for the party's alliances with the ruling elite that I will lay out in my talk. But then Stalinism was a perspective of nationalism, and thus split along the lines of the Sino-Soviet dispute. The rival national interests of the USSR and China splintered in the late 1950s and led to an all-out conflict in the 1960s that split the Communist Party of the Philippines into 2 rival parties oriented to rival sections of the elite. the USSR-oriented party was bent upon establishing ties with the USSR through relations with autocratic figures. And Moscow established ties with Suharto after his rise to power in Indonesia, and was poised to establish ties with Marcos if he were to impose dictatorship in the Philippines. This became the orientation of the pro-Moscow Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, or PKP. The CPP, meanwhile, followed the line of Beijing of armed struggle throughout the countryside of the world. This allowed them to retain hold over the social unrest of the time. The overwhelming majority of protests at the time, etc., and they were exploding, were tied to the line of the CPP because it was seen as the bearer of true radicalism. And they brought all of this energy behind their allies, the conspiring sections of the elite who were looking to remove Marcos from office. Now, if you're interested in the details of these arguments, I've published 2 articles lately. One called "We Are Siding with Filipino Capitalists: Nationalism and the Political Maturation of Jose Maria Sison," came out in Sojourn a couple weeks ago. It's quite interesting, I think, in terms of where Sison himself came from. The second came out in Critical Asian Studies about 4 weeks ago. It's entitled "The Geopolitical Alignments of Diverging Social Interests, the Sino-Soviet Split in the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas." I lay out my arguments in great detail there. You can go and look. Now, Sison responded, the head of the Stalinist Communist Party, that in fact, the arguments about parties' culpability for the bombing were false. Here were his basic arguments that he has repeated time and again. 1, as a matter of principle and procedure, the CPP chairman cannot give orders to physically attack allies. Now, he's admitting here that the Liberal Party were the allies of the CPP. But of course, this is nowhere in the constitution of the CPP. You cannot physically attack allies. Nor, for that matter, is it at all observed by the party. The party has engaged in acts of provocative violence on numerous occasions. Second, Sison claims that the Plaza Miranda bombing allegations were dismissed in the 1989 Blue Ribbon probe by the Senate and by the 1994 Criminal Proceedings investigation. Now, what he leaves out is that there were investigations that were conducted, but that the Blue Ribbon probe never concluded. It simply abandoned. They were not dismissed. It just dropped its investigation because there was a major coup attempt in November 1989, which I remember vividly, having lived through it. And because the Senate turned its attention to the question of the renewal of the US bases. The Blue Ribbon probe disappeared. The 1994 criminal proceedings was dismissed in a pro forma fashion. It never stated its conclusions or its findings. They were dismissed because that was the very month in which Fidel Ramos attempted to conclude a ceasefire with the CPP as part of peace negotiations. The criminal proceedings were dropped precisely because they were a barrier to the peace negotiations, which got farther with the Ramos administration than I would argue with any prior administration or subsequent. There was no substantive rebuttal produced. These are not evidence against the charges. Sison claims that Marcos's defense minister, Juan Ponce Enrile, who subsequently turned against Marcos and became part of the Aquino administration, claimed responsibility for the bombing. Sison has said this on numerous occasions. No, he did not. Enrile came out in 1986 in an interview with the New York Times in which he claimed that he had staged an attack on his own motorcade as the final pretext for military dictatorship. September 22, 1972. He never took responsibility for Plaza Miranda. Sison claims that the journalist turned anti-Marcos publisher Primitivo Mijares, in a very influential book called Conjugal Dictatorship, says that Marcos did it. This is a speculative and baseless claim. Mijares has no evidence to present on this point. He is claiming that Marcos bombed Plaza Miranda to bring revelations that he had stolen the Golden Buddha. I don't have time to go into all the details. It's a fascinating little story. The treasure hunter claimed that he had found a golden Buddha statue and that Marcos stole it. It was supposedly part of the Yamashita treasure. It was supposed to weigh a ton and be solid gold. The entire thing was bunkum. And it was across the pages of the major dailies during early 1971. Sison claims that Raymond Bonner, who was a journalist who wrote a very important book called Waltzing with a Dictator, excellent book, on the imposition of dictatorship, by Ferdinand Marcos in the role of US imperialism. That Bonner says that the CIA say that the CPP did not do it. It's interesting that Sison holds up the CIA here as a positive source, but Bonner's citation of the CIA here is completely wrong. If you look at it, you'll see that Bonner is citing an anonymous CIA source whose only evidence is the CPP had no forces in the Manila at the time. That's it. He claims the CPP was non-existent in the city, which, as I'm about to demonstrate, is utterly baseless. The CPP's organization in Manila far outweighed its weight in the countryside. It was immensely influential in the city through its front organizations, through its ideological influence, etc. And finally, Sison argues that the party does not engage in putschist violence. We know this is false. The party has routinely staged acts of provocative violence, the throwing of bombs, throwing of Molotov cocktails from picket lines in order to provoke violence against the workers as a means of compelling them to revolution, etc. This is a standard practice of the party, and I document numerous instances of this in my scholarship. All right, I want to walk through now, in a somewhat overview manner, the developments that led to the Plaza Miranda bombing and its outcome. The Plaza Miranda bombing came out of the entire upheaval that led to the Plaza Miranda bombing came out of the 1969 elections. For the ruling opposition, this was a devastating moment. Marcos became the first re-elected president in Philippine history. Sergio Osmeña, Liberal Party candidate, famously said, "We were outgunned, outgooned, and outgoaled." And it is a famous witticism, but one must say it was not for want of trying. Osmeña and the Liberal Party spent a fortune to purchase Malacanang. In the end, Osmeña lost because Marcos was able to tap into mass sentiment more than he was. They both spent an outrageous amount of money, but Osmeña denounced Marcos for being insufficiently pro-American and for forming an alliance with the Soviet Union. He denounced Marcos for being, quote, pro-red. That's a direct quote. And this did not stick. And in fact, in the emerging situation of upheaval, it actually garnered credibility for Marcos. And it created an extraordinary situation in which the incumbent was able to run as the candidate of change. In the wake of the 1969 election, there emerged a consolidation of interests among the ruling elite who were excluded from power or were being excluded from power by Marcos. I have termed them the conspiring understudies. Expanding my metaphor of the drama of dictatorship, these conspiring understudies were plotting to remove Marcos, not because they opposed martial law, but because they were opposed to his position. They wanted to be the dictator. And we have statements from most of these figures that they, if they were in office, would impose martial law. Jokno in 1971 said martial law was necessary. Aquino told the US Embassy and others that if he were in office, he would impose martial law. Sergio Osmeña attempted through assassinations to remove Marcos from office, hiring hitmen. Fernando and Eugenio Lopez, businessmen and vice president, funded the opposition. There was a consolidation of elite interests against Marcos. It consolidated at a time of social explosion. Rising prices, the war in Vietnam, global unrest led to an explosion of protests in the Philippines. From January to March, we see the first quarter storm, which is an explosion of protests, particularly among young people, brutally suppressed by Marcos's police. The elite funded the front organizations of the CPP. This is a drama that was staged by the front organizations of the CPP, the STK in this case, called Barricada, the Barricades. It was staged at Meralco Theater, owned by the family of the vice president, and it was funded by the elite. The elite provided national television access on a weekly basis to the front organizations of the CPP. Almost daily radio broadcasts and direct funding to their organizations. It is extraordinary the level of support that they provided to the CPP from 1970 to 1972. The CPP, as a result, had immense influence. The statement of the CIA officer in Raymond Bonner's account that they had no influence in Manila is grossly off base. Every major student paper at the time was following the line of the CPP. This is the masthead of the Philippine College of Commerce newspaper, Ang Malaya, the young woman with the Armalite, holding Lipunan at Revolusyon ng Pilipinas, the LRP, the Philippine Society and Revolution, and the red flag. We see here an editorial page from a shared editorial throughout all student papers in the country. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. The influence extended through every aspect of youth and student life in Manila. A critical point needs to be made. While the elite were allied with the CPP, Marcos allied with the PKP, and in fact, the PKP began working with the military to stage bombings throughout Manila in order to provide a pretext for martial law. Here is a publication of the Young Communist League, Ang Mandirigma, that directly takes credit for the bombing of Arca, one of the critical bombings that Marcos would blame on the Maoists. It was carried out by the pro-Moscow party allied to Marcos. Marcos himself was responsible for the bombings that were a pretext for martial law, with one exception. The bombing of Plaza Miranda does not fit the modus operandi of Marcos in any way, who would bomb facilities late at night with no injuries and chalk it up as an action of the CPP. It's fundamentally different. This was public knowledge. Here you see on the left-hand side a publication of the SDK in 1972 saying, look, the PKP is carrying out bombings with the military on behalf of Ferdinand Marcos. Drama Sison, in the pages of Ang Bayan, launched what was known as a third period. The third period derives from a period in Stalinist history in which the forces of the Stalinist communist parties in Europe, and in particular the German Communist Party, announced that if Hitler took to power, he would crush their rivals, the Social Democrats, organizations of workers who were not in the Communist Party, and after Hitler, us. Martial law will lead to revolution. After Hitler, us. Social Democrats are social fascists, something that the CPP was actually saying in 1971, and broke away from the established unions of the working class to form red unions. Sison declared that military repression and dictatorship hastened the advance of the revolutionary masses. In this global context of unrest, in which Nixon was now reaching out to Mao, the war in Vietnam, and the ending of the Bretton Woods Agreement, we see social unrest everywhere. This was expressed in the Philippines very sharply. Workers were fired on in January in what became known as the Plaza Miranda massacre, something forgotten in the events of August, when the Plaza Miranda massacre came to refer to the bombing of the Liberal Party rally. Barricades were erected in February, something I've written an article on. The CPP split the workers' unions in February and established their own red unions, which they operated out of the University of the Philippines. There were repeated jeepney driver strikes. In December, we see the raid on the PMA armory carried out by Victor Corpus, the Plaza Miranda bombing. This is a bit of a repetition, sorry. Then in March, one of the central members of the Communist Party was assassinated by Carlos del Rosario. His body was never found. An officer in the Philippine military, in the military academy, Crispin Tagamolila, defected, and workers were fired on by machine guns from the top of City Hall in what became known as May Day Massacre. The brother of Drama Sison was killed in June or July. There were strikes. Clark Air Base was subject to strikes at this time. It rattled the nerve center of US imperialism. Rice prices were skyrocketing. The Liberal Party allied themselves with this social unrest through the CPP. Sonny Osmeña, you see him here, he was 36, he looked 18, senatorial candidate for the Liberal Party, burned a copy of the Penal Code on stage. He used the Internationale as his political campaign song while the Philippine Constabulary and the Boy Scouts stood at attention. Jovito Salonga declared to the press, if the Marcos administration repeats its conduct during the 1969 elections in 1971, then we know what we will do. Ibagsak si Marcos, itanghalang baril. Raise up the gun. These forces were turning towards armed struggle, they claimed. They were adopting the language of the CPP. The CPP, meanwhile, issued a declaration in August, on August 15, 1971, first through the SDK and then throughout all of its organizations, that it was going to be turning away from barricades, from Molotov cocktails, to form community service organizations. filling potholes. They were going to avoid, quote, underground styles of organization. And they instructed their members to join the Student Catholic Association, religious fraternities, and business organizations. They were lurching to the right in anticipation of a crackdown that would see them integrating into the Liberal Party. Let's skip this slide. The bombing itself was carried out by Dani Cordero in conjunction with two other members who are named in my work. Dani Cordero then went to the northern province of Isabela. In the wake of the bombing, the prominent question that emerged was, where is Aquino? Ninoy Aquino was not present at the bombing. After the head count, through the numbness, the question that pops up, wrote Ninoch Carrasca, famed author, is where in God's name is Benigno Aquino Jr., the so-called Wonder Boy? Ninoy appears later, unscathed. By virtue of what he recounts later is an amazing series of coincidences and the closest of calls. Ninoy, in the wake of the bombing, went around carrying a semi-automatic gun. You can't really see it in this picture, but the caption says Benigno Aquino with gun in hand. He went to visit all of the hospitals, etc., toting this gun. He claimed that he had been at the party, and then he went home to get a bulletproof vest, and this is why he was not at the bombing at the time that at the rally at the time that the bombing took place. Marcos seized upon the bombing to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and round up all of the sort of radical opposition. He rounded up members of the KM and the SDK, arresting over 120, none of whom were charged with the Plaza Miranda bombing. It was a dry run for martial law. Marcos accused Aquino of having carried out the bombing, something that he subsequently sort of dropped in the wake of the election as he realized that he needed to lie low on his political charges for a time after his electoral defeat. Joma Sison lied and told the press, "I have never met Senator Aquino." This is false. It was in fact Aquino himself who had arranged the first meeting between the founding members of the NPA and Joma Sison at the founding of the CPP. The organizations of the CPP joined with the organizations of the Liberal Party to found the Movement of Concerned Citizens for the Advancement of Civil Liberties, or the Defense of Civil Liberties. They staged rallies. In one of those rallies in Caloocan, they were attacked by armed thugs, and children as young as 9 were killed by these thugs. The end result of the election was an overwhelming defeat for the candidates of Marcos. 6 victories for the 6 seats for the Liberal Party, 2 for Marcos. A key ally of the CPP, formed of the SDK and KM, etc., the Movement for a Democratic Philippines, issued a statement. The Filipino masses intelligently saw through the transparent democratic mask of the fascist administration and fully repudiated the fascist regime of Marcos. Now, I don't know what intelligence you need to see through a transparent mask, but they were claiming that this electoral victory was the repudiation of fascism. Marcos responded to the election by dropping charges against Aquino. He dropped that issue and calling for national unity. And the LP, the Liberal Party, responded warmly, welcoming Marcos. One of the most interesting things of 1972 is everyone is still talking about martial law because the unrest has not gone away. But the antagonisms between Marcos and the Liberal Party disappeared from January to May. They were all looking towards the election of 1973. Things changed, however, when Marcos made a separate peace with the Lopez brothers, offering them what they wanted for Meralco, reduced oil prices, etc. And when the Lopez brothers broke with the Liberal Party opposition, removing ABS-CBN from its orbit, it was then that Marcos moved to impose martial law. I have a few final points that I want to make. Dani Cordero, who had gone to Isabela, was executed in just before the arrival of arms from China. I detail this in to a considerable extent in my doctoral dissertation. He was executed because he was speaking up against the leadership, because the leadership was conducting the affairs of the NPA in ways that he disagreed with. It was not originally about Miranda. But to defend himself, He said, "I threw the grenade at Miranda." And it was thus that a tribunal was formed and Danny Cordero was sentenced to be executed. There was a split vote of 4-4. 4 for execution, 4 for a lesser sentence. Ruben Guevara was the deciding vote, overruling 5-4, calling for Danny Cordero's execution. They sang the Internationale and shot Danny Cordero in the back of the head. Marcos managed to capture all of the arms that were sent from China in the Karagatan arms debacle and imposed martial law in September 1972. Joma Sison responded to the imposition of martial law in Ang Bayan on the 1st of October, 1972. We consider the present situation far more favorable to the revolutionary movement than ever before. Things would not have stood out as clearly now were it not for the fascist viciousness of the US Marcos dictatorship. More favorable than ever before, thanks for the fascist viciousness of Marcos. The more the workers' rights are suppressed, the more the workers become fearless. The violent suppression of workers' unions and strikes can only yield more determined fighters for the revolutionary cause. Fascist dictatorship, military dictatorship is good for revolution. This was the line of the party. They welcomed martial law. Now, I have 2 final slides. The first is this: the task of the historian, my task, the task of scholars, is not to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. I'm not a prosecutor. It is to demonstrate what the preponderance of evidence suggests and to establish on this basis what likely happened. The preponderance of evidence overwhelmingly suggests that the CPP was responsible. The additional evidence, if we get new evidence come in, may further substantiate this conclusion or compel its revision. We need to get additional evidence. That's how scholarship always works. At this point, the weight of historical evidence weighs strongly on the side of the culpability of Sison and the CPP. Here's my final point. In the video that I showed you, Sison said, the best thing that can happen for the benefit of the Philippine Revolution is for Duterte to impose a fascist dictatorship on the people. Take note of this. This has always been their perspective. Leon Trotsky in December 1931, warning the German working class of what was imminent, 1933, the rise of Hitler to power, wrote, "Worker communists, you are hundreds of thousands, millions. You cannot leave for anywhere. There are not enough passports for you. Should fascism achieve power, it will ride over your skulls and spines like a frightful tank. Your salvation lies in merciless struggle. And only unity and struggle with the social democratic workers can bring victory, the unity of the working class. Make haste, worker communists. You have very little time left." There are not enough passports for the Filipino working class. If Duterte or a replacement to Duterte, in fact, carried out fascist dictatorship, as Joma Sison would welcome, they will not be in Utrecht, unlike Joma Sison. It will ride over their skulls and spines like a frightful tank. Learn the lessons of the Plaza Miranda bombing. They are absolutely critical. It is impossible to defend democracy or the interests of the working class through a program that first foments, provokes, and then welcomes fascist dictatorship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. I'm going to open it up for questions soon, but before that, I want to ask a question of my own. And we were talking about this, Joseph. I mentioned that I have some connection with the Plaza Miranda bombing. My grand aunt was Senator Eva Estrada Calao. She was one of the Liberal Party senators who was bombed at that time. There are 2 things that are interesting about her. The first thing is that, well, she was the only woman there. The second thing is that she was the first cousin of Benigno Ninoy Aquino. And then both of us have, of course, studied, this is what we have in common. We both really studied Aquino's connections with the Communist Party. And I think we're both in agreement that at this point, he was super close to the Communist Party. And we know that the liaison was another Ruben Carubio Tuazon. And who he would actually, Tuazon, if he were alive, he would be the person to interview because he would know Aquino's knowledge of the bombing. So I have kind of 2 contradictory bits of evidence here. On the one hand, I know that Tuazon was likely coordinating with Aquino that night, or at the very least had a call with Aquino. I got this from an anonymous source. So that lends credibility to the theory that he knew about the bombing. And I have another bit of evidence, which is family history. And our family history, we always talk about Lola Eva's stories about the bombing. And she remembers that when Ninoy arrived in the bombing, that Ninoy kept shouting, "Where's Prima? Where's Prima? Is she okay?" So
Yes.
had he known about it, right, I'm sure he would have informed his cousin. And I can attest to the fact that they were super close and that Lola Eva was super fond of him. And I don't think he would have allowed her to get hurt. So I mean, my question for you is, what do you make of these like two bits of evidence that I have here?
The question of the complicity or non-complicity of Aquino in a good many things is fraught, and I'm not going to put my money down, certainly in this talk.
I know you wanted to punt that, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
It's a critical question that needs to be addressed. There are not just one, but multiple strands of evidence that Aquino was notified in advance, and that is why he missed. Most of them tying, as you said, through Ruben Tuazon. We know through in CPP accounts that were published recently that Ruben Tuazon was incredibly close to Aquino, even on his staff, and that they had a very close relationship. I won't go into all of the details.
Yeah, and de Luisita.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There were others as well, tied to the front organizations of the CPP who were on the staff of Ninoy Aquino. The ties to the CPP are beyond dispute. The question is of the Plaza Miranda bombing itself. And what do we know are irrefutable facts? Aquino was absent. That is very unusual. And further, Aquino was or could be ruthless. We've seen that repeatedly in his political history. Those weigh on one side. On the other side, it would be out of keeping with his behavior. And this is purely speculative, but I know the man fairly well now as a historian. It would have been out of keeping with his political behavior to have allowed this to occur to his Liberal Party allies. Was it possible that he was aware that something would occur, but not the extent of the damage? I have no idea. It's purely speculative, and I don't really want to go there. It is a fraught historical question that cannot yet be resolved. The point of my talk, and that's why I steered clear of this question, is the role of the CPP, which I would argue, unlike the case of Aquino, the jury really isn't out on this one any longer. The weight of historical evidence weighs on the side of the CPP's culpability.
Okay, so let's move on to the questions. Thank you for that. We have a question from Luisito de la Cruz. Is the speaker in opposition to the ideals, goals, and beliefs of the whole CPP, or just the ideas and practices of Jose Maria Sison, its patriarch? It's interesting, patriarch. If the speaker answers in the affirmative, then what could have been a better alternative for some of the reasonable and legitimate aims of the CPP, such as, but not limited to, genuine land reform, neocolonial ties, and their negative effects on Philippine social, on the social economic situation in the Philippines, elite democracy, among other things?
It's an extended question, and it pertains to my political perspectives, which may be a secondary question for a historical talk, but I'll give a brief answer, since certainly this is a very political talk. I am not hostile to what are the goals of members who are drawn to the CPP, the achievement of land reform, the ending of poverty in the Philippines, and so on. What I oppose, and what is not limited to Sison, is the program itself of the party. This is something I've had to stress in my writing, and I've tried to analyze. It doesn't stem from the particular rottenness or opportunism of individual leaders, but from the political program of Stalinism, which is an orientation to a section of the ruling elite and an opposition to the independent struggle of workers for socialism. And in that sense, I would argue I'm a genuine Marxist, and Sison is not. If you're interested in exploring that further, I would encourage you to watch an earlier talk that I gave on the support of Sison for Duterte, where I lay this out in considerable detail.
All right, thank you. Another question from Gerard Lopez. Do you believe that the CPP gatekeeps the Philippine left with a movement for council communism, libertarian socialism in closed captions? Would ever be possible? Would that be possible in the Philippines in opposition to state socialism, i.e., USSR and China, and advocate council democracy in such a context, like the Philippine left? Like the Philippine left solely within the MLM lines. I didn't get that last part, but I think you get an idea of the question.
there's two parts to this. Does the CPP gatekeep? Absolutely. I'm going to try and deal with the light here. It's just shining off of my unfortunately bald forehead. There we are. Does the CPP gatekeep? Absolutely. The CPP presents itself as the definite article Philippine left. In fact, as a formulation I used in a recent article is there is no left but the CPP and Sison is its prophet. That's the conception that he has regarding the left in the Philippines that has been promulgated by national democracy in general. So is there gatekeeping? Yes. And those who do not conform to that gatekeeping are denounced as agents of the CIA, supporters of authoritarian militarism, fascist dictatorship, etc. Psywar agents, like me. That's how people who oppose them are denounced. It's impossible to oppose the CPP from the left, they claim. That's gatekeeping. As for the specifics of council communism and so on, what political form wins out in opposition to the CPP is not, I think, a place for the historian to say. That will be decided in struggle. That will be decided in struggle, not simply between individuals, but between programs, which vie for leadership over masses of people. One of the barriers to the struggle between contending programs is that the CPP it resorts to slander and lies, and it's very difficult, therefore, for conceptions that are more democratic, for example, to find an audience. I think that hold, however, over popular conception, popular consciousness by the CPP is breaking up. And I think that explains a certain degree of the unhinged nature of their denunciations of my scholarship.
Thank you. Now from Mark Jetro Inigo, do you think that martial law would have happened if not for Sison's actions?
Do I think that martial law would have happened without Plaza Miranda bombing?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I do. And this is a really good question because I explicitly state in my doctoral dissertation that my argument about martial law, which is the core of my forthcoming book, is not in any way tied to the specifics of the Plaza Miranda bombing, which was a great historical tragedy. But Marcos and the opposition, all of them were forthrightly declaring the need for martial law long before Plaza Miranda and continued to do so afterwards. Plaza Miranda may have accelerated the pace, but it was not decisive. But there is a second element to your question. Without the actions of Sison, well, interpreted in a broader frame, that would mean without the role played by the Communist Party. And it is my contention that the two rival Stalinist parties, the PKP, which supported Marcos, declared him progressive, carried out bombings to facilitate his imposition of martial law, and after martial law was imposed, endorsed his administration. And the CPP, which took all of the mass opposition of the time and allied it to the conspirators for the throne. Aquino wasn't a democratic force, I argue. He was vying to be dictator himself. He stated he would impose martial law. And thus, there was no independent movement in defense of democracy. And in that sense, I argue that the two Stalinist parties were the decisive subjective factor in making martial law possible.
We have a question from Carl Tulio. Is there any situation where the CPP's penchant for accelerationism, Joseph, could you define that as well, be considered justifiable?
So the idea of accelerationism is, and this is a term not so much used by the CPP as trying to interpret their perspective. Accelerationism is things are proceeding towards a revolutionary struggle, but we can accelerate the revolutionary struggle by instigating state repression, because state repression educates. And I would answer absolutely not, because, and here I would be citing Marx, or for that matter, even Lenin. The fundamental task of the Revolutionary Party isn't to provoke the state to repress the workers so that the workers go, ow, the state is hitting me, revolution. The task of a party is to explain to workers what capitalism is, why capitalism will exploit them no matter what, and why therefore they need a political alternative, socialism, and how they can organize to achieve socialism. In other words, patient explanation, education, organization. Accelerationism is the desperate act, frankly, of sort of anarchistic violence to foment state repression in order to consolidate the interests of the party, which sees its own interests served through what it calls fascist dictatorship. This is political poison.
All right, I'm gonna ask two questions that are related to the CPP of today. CM Gaerlan, if the Plaza Miranda bombing was the handiwork of the CPP, do you think there's a possibility that they'll do the same thing again today? And then Jerry Clarito, based on your findings, what do you make of the current leadership of the CPP? Are they burying the Plaza Miranda tragedy as if it did not happen? Are there members of the leadership digging into the truth of the tragedy? That's a difficult question, but I want to pose it anyway, just to see what you think. Because the thing is, they're opaque. The leadership is opaque now. Like, we don't know the membership of the Central Committee unless you do, Joseph. I don't. But anyway, have a stab at it. Have a go.
Sure. A horrifying and important question. One I was not prepared for. Would they do such a thing again? I don't know. I hate to speculate on such a thing, but nothing has fundamentally changed in terms of re-examining the lessons of this, the political program of the party. You heard the speech of Sison from 3 or 4 days ago. Fascist dictatorship is the best thing that can happen for the revolution. It's impossible to say what sort of actions a person who espouses such a political view would take. So is it still something they would do? Possibly. In the end, the fundamental question isn't would they engage in a terrorist attack or of some sort or not. The fundamental question is, to what end are they orienting the struggles of Filipino workers, peasants, and oppressed masses in the context of COVID-19, increased repression under Duterte, etc.? And the answer is to an alliance with the ruling opposition and to an appeal to coup-plotting layers of the military. Sison has issued appeals to the pro-US and patriotic layers of the military, he calls them, to withdraw support from Duterte and install Leni Robredo. He's made multiple statements to that effect over the past year. That's his orientation. There is no way to defend democracy in that way. Second point, has there been a sort of, what's the status of leadership in the party?
Are
My
they
sense
open
of
to
things,
investigating it?
Is there is a great deal of gap between the old layers who still control the ideological line of the party and an untrained younger layer who are being treated as activists, that they have not educated the new layer for leadership. And that the party is, to an extent, geriatric.
They have, in fact, become Soviet in that sense. And another possible division is really a certain group of people who grew up under the party system, who have become enamored with parliamentary politics, right?
There are multiple possible fragmentations that could occur in the event the central leadership no longer was present.
Right. Question from Tushara Vijayaratna. I'm sorry for butchering your name. We have seen in the US a section, a very, very small minority at the moment, gravitating towards Trump and fascism as a way to topple bourgeois democracy. What are the lessons we can learn from the recent history of the Philippines? What do you think causes opposition to the US government to be channeled towards fascism?
I think the lesson, this is not simply a lesson of the Philippines or of 2016 and the rise of Trump or of the January 6 events, but the lesson of the rise of fascism in general. And here, speaking as an historian, trying with a sort of big picture perspective. Fascism emerges out of periods of intense political crisis, not stability. And it expresses the interests of demoralized and disenfranchised layers of the petty bourgeoisie, the lower middle class, who feel themselves threatened by the crisis and are mobilized against workers. The emergence of fascism politically is thus bound up with the bankruptcy of the left, which cannot present a political alternative, does not therefore mobilize a coherent opposition to fascism. The critical political perspective against the rise of fascism, in my opinion, is not about trying to consolidate around some center, but about presenting a viable left perspective to win over the support of workers. And I think we see this in the Philippines, and I think we see this in the January 6 events, and I think we see this with the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s.
Great. Other questions? We have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Okay, let me just ask another question, which is, why do you think the party is so sensitive about issues surrounding Plaza Miranda? Why does it create such vitriol? First directed towards Greg Jones and now towards you. Why? It happened in 71, right?
That's a terrific question. And what is more, to sort of underline this, Plaza Miranda, even if it's established incontrovertibly that it was a crime carried out by the CPP, is not the greatest crime committed by the CPP. Not by a long shot. The party in the 1980s oversaw multiple instances of internal purges that were responsible for the mass murder of about 1,000 or over 1,000 of their own cadre in anti-deep penetration agent purges, witch hunts, that were carried out by torture, mass graves, etc. An extraordinary crime. And yet the CPP admits that this is actually part of its history. John Masison and company try to blame rogue elements, etc. But this is an undeniable part of CPP history. Why then is Plaza Miranda the most sensitive issue in all of party history? I think without a doubt. I think the answer is because the core of the party's program is about establishing an alliance with a section of the bourgeoisie. Always has been. It's why they established an alliance with Duterte in 2016. It's why they front organizations tied to the CPP campaign for Manny Villar in 2010 and down the line, all of these alliances. And if it's documented that the CPP blew up the party rally of their own allies, what will that do for their ability to form an alliance in the future? Who's going to want to ally with a party that might murder them? And I think their sensitivity to this issue reflects their sensitivity about securing an alliance with a section of the elite. I think they have a certain degree of comfort that may be misplaced, but of comfort in the idea that when workers and when peasants and when the poor look for an alternative, they're going to look to the CPP because they're it. Right?
No, I think that's absolutely right, and that I think that explains the behavior of Noynoy Aquino around them. Because you remember, Korea died, members of the party rallied and wore yellow to celebrate the life of the former president, and I think they were expecting some kind of alliance with Noynoy Aquino, but Noynoy is a lot more anti-CPP than his father was, and I think part of it may have something to do with the history you're talking about. I could just weigh in there. But I want to get to a question from Bobby Garcia. And Bob, itong tanong mo gusto kong itanong sa'yo. This question of yours, Bobby, is a question I want to ask of you. But we'll ask Joseph what he thinks. I'm also interested in what Joseph has to think. But actually interested in Bobby Garcia asks, are you open to entering into a tactical alliance with PNPA, given that they have obviously shifted to an explicitly anti-Duterte stance to fight the current fascist administration?
You broke up there right at the beginning. Did you say, are you
open to entering into a tactical alliance with the CPP NPA?
That's addressed to me as a scholar.
Yeah.
First of all, I'm a scholar. I don't form tactical alliances. But second, let me make a political point. Absolutely not. No. The political program of the CPP is not about its temporary position vis-a-vis this or that section of the ruling elite. I am, and I've explicitly stated this, I'm a Marxist scholar. And I believe the position of Marxism carried out by Lenin and Trotsky is for the political independence of the working class. The CPP is hostile to that. The fact that it's currently hostile to Duterte doesn't mean it's going to mobilize an independent struggle of workers against Duterte. It means it's going to organize a struggle of workers behind a different section of the elite. And I oppose such a thing. So no. Now, that said, I responded sharply to the point because it's a critical political point. I'm glad to have you on the call, Bobby Garcia. And I just spoke of the purges as one of the greatest, or the greatest crime of the CPP's history. And your book documenting this is absolutely central. And I thank you for your work on that.
Deborah Edmondson, are the Filipino working class better off under Duterte or his opposition?
Are the Filipino working class better off under Duterte or under the opposition to Duterte? Well, the opposition to Duterte is out of power right now. And one would say in the short term, they're better off under the opposition to Duterte. Duterte represents a campaign of mass murder that has killed 30,000 people. My political point isn't that Leni Robredo would carry out the same campaign of mass murder. My political point is that once you have on stage the specter of fascism, it has social roots. And Those social roots don't go away when you elect a rival representative. The danger represented by Trump isn't Trump himself, it's the mass movement that he's trying to cultivate. And that doesn't go away just because Joe Biden is in office. And I would argue that what is more, it cannot go away when you have a figure like Joe Biden in office, who represents an appeal to the Republicans to try and not be Trumpish. And the same, I would argue, is true of Leni Robredo. And thus, while she likely would not be overseeing, I would argue almost certainly would not be overseeing this campaign of mass murder, I don't think that she represents a solution to the problem that Duterte represents.
All right. One last question. I'm sorry, there were new questions that popped up, but I can only this. Joma still described the Philippine society as semi-colonial and semi-feudal, the basis for their national democratic line. Has the mode of production changed since the 1950s? Is the Philippines a capitalist now? Actually, well, this is from MC Canlas. If I may weigh in on this, I'd like you actually to read the debates around this that were being published by the Third World Studies Center in the 80s and the early 90s, because that's where this mode of production debate really got debated. But anyway, Joseph, what do you think?
Sure. Now, it's a fascinating debate, and it runs throughout the history of a lot of sort of Philippine academia, and it has ties to the Philippine left. The argument of the CPP is that the Philippine mode of production is semi-colonial, semi-feudal. And that means that it remains largely agrarian, and that the political system is not yet bourgeois democratic. It is still, as it says, colonial and feudal, at least in Malapiudan, etc. Has the mode of production changed? That's the first aspect of your question. The mode of production has undoubtedly developed. And anyone who wants to claim that the line that was written in 1969 regarding the Philippine economy reflects post-globalization Philippines is blinded, willfully blinded to the conditions of the economy in the Philippines at present. And probably could only write such a line if they were in the Netherlands. But I would like to go further back. I don't think the Philippines was semi-colonial, semi-feudal at the time that the line was written. Capitalism is not a national development. One does not suss out the condition of economics in a specific nation independent of the global market and then say this particular economy is capitalist, not capitalist. No, world economy is capitalist. The Philippines is inextricably connected to the world economy. World capitalist economy is combined and uneven in its development, and thus the Philippine economy is combined and uneven in its development. But it is, and has been since the onset of modern industrial capitalism, capitalist. For all of its agricultural character and so on, capitalism isn't fundamentally about industrialization. Capitalism is fundamentally about a global system of wage labor and commodity production that is in some of its centers is industrialized, in some areas agricultural, but it is a world system, not a national system. The debate is fundamentally a nationalist debate, reflecting the perspective of the CPP, a nationalist perspective, and I think the perspective of a critique of that must be internationalist.
All right, we are exactly, it's exactly 6:30, so we are done. Thank you, Joseph Scalice, for this
Thank you, Lendoy.
provocative talk. Maraming salamat.